The scent of roasted boar and spiced wine was a thick, cloying blanket in the great hall, a stark contrast to the sharp, clean smell of the lye soap on Alara's chapped hands. She kept her head down, her world reduced to the grimy flagstones under her scrubbing brush. Here, in the shadows, she was invisible, a ghost in a servant's drab tunic, a silent wraith moving through the raucous celebration of the blood moon feast. It was exactly where she needed to be. Invisibility was safety, silence was survival. Her gaze flickered upward for just a moment, a moth drawn to a devastating flame. Across the hall, seated on the high throne carved from ancient weirwood, was him, Alpha Kalen. His laughter was a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards and straight into her bones. He was all sharp angles and coiled power, his dark hair brushing the collar of his fine leather jerkin. Even from this distance, his scent cut through the chaos of the feast pine needles after a hard frost, the clean bite of winter air, and something else, something wild and possessive that called to a part of her she kept ruthlessly chained. Mate. The word was a silent scream in her mind, a treasonous, hopeless whisper. The moon goddess had a cruel sense of humor, pairing a mute, disgraced servant with the most powerful alpha in the 5 territories. He was surrounded by beauty and influence, noble daughters preening for his attention. At his side, leaning in to whisper in his ear, was Lady Seraphina. Her perfume, a heavy cloud of night-blooming jasmine, was an assault on Alara's senses. It smelled cloying and false, a sweet veneer over something bitter and wrong. Alara focused back on her work, the rhythmic scrape of bristles on stone a familiar prayer. She had been in this keep for 5 years, ever since the fall of her own, ever since she had taken the vow of silence, a magical lock on her tongue to protect the last remnant of her family. No one here knew her as Princess Alara, of the Silverwood line. They knew her only as the silent girl, the one with the haunted gray eyes who never caused any trouble. Her own scent, the mark of her lineage wildflowers and starlight, was carefully masked by the bitter herbs she crushed into her soap each morning. To them, she smelled of nothing but poverty and lie. A hush fell over a section of the hall as Lady Seraphina rose, a silver goblet in her hand. Her dress was the color of blood, glittering like a treasure vault under the torchlight. She moved with a predator's grace, her smile a beautiful, dangerous thing. "To our magnificent Alpha," she purred, her voice carrying across the hall. "May his strength continue to be our shield, and his wisdom our guide." The toast was met with roars of approval. Kalen inclined his head, a faint, weary smile touching his lips. He accepted the goblet from her, his fingers brushing hers. It was a perfectly crafted moment, a public display of intimacy that sent a spike of something sharp and ugly through Alara's chest. Jealousy. It was a useless, poisonous emotion. But as Kalen raised the goblet, something else pricked at her senses. Beneath the cloying jasmine of Seraphina's perfume and the rich aroma of the wine, a fainter, more sinister scent unfurled. It was acrid and earthy, the smell of crushed nightshade root. Poison. Not a lethal dose, not for an alpha, but enough to weaken, to cloud the mind, to make one susceptible. And woven through it, a thin, shimmering thread of magic, smelling of deceit and coercion. A compulsion charm. Panic seized her, a cold, frantic terror that stole the air from her lungs. She could not speak. She could not shout a warning. To reveal her knowledge of such things was to reveal her own nature, to shatter the fragile safety she had built. But to do nothing, to watch her mate, the other half of her soul, drink that poison, it was unthinkable. He was lifting the goblet to his lips. Time seemed to stretch. And then, the roar of the hall faded to a distant hum. The only thing that existed was the silver cup, the dark wine, and the man she secretly, desperately loved. Her body moved before her mind could protest, acting on an instinct fiercer than fear. She pushed herself to her feet, her bucket of grimy water clutched in one hand. With a clumsy, desperate lurch, she stumbled forward, directly into the path of a passing steward. The collision was jarring. Alara went down hard, the bucket flying from her grasp. Soapy, dirty water arced through the air in a perfect, horrifying trajectory, drenching the Alpha's boots and splashing up the front of Lady Seraphina's crimson gown. The silver goblet, knocked from Kaelin's startled grasp, clattered to the floor, its poisoned contents spreading in a dark stain across the stones. Silence. It was absolute and terrifying. Every eye in the great hall was on her. A collapsed, dripping heap on the floor. Lady Seraphina's gasp was a shard of ice. But it was Kaelin's gaze that held her, that pinned her to the spot. His amber eyes, normally warm like whiskey, were chips of frozen stone. The air crackled with his fury, a palpable pressure that made it hard to breathe. His scent had changed, the clean frost turning into the sharp, dangerous smell of an impending storm. What is the meaning of this? His voice was not a shout, but a low, deadly growl that promised retribution. Alara could only stare up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had saved him, and in doing so, she had just condemned herself. Alara remained on her knees, the cold of the damp stones seeping through her thin tunic. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, on the spreading pool of wine that smelled of lies and death. She could feel the weight of hundreds of stares, but Kaelin's was a physical force, pressing down on her, demanding an answer she could not give. "I asked you a question, girl." His voice was closer. Now, silk over steel. She risked a glance up through her lashes. He stood over her, a towering figure of wrath. The spilled water had darkened the hem of his trousers, and a few drops clung to the fine leather of his boots. Beside him, Lady Seraphina was making a small, distressed sound, dabbing at her ruined dress with a delicate hand. Her eyes, when they met Alara's, were filled with a triumphant, venomous hatred. This was even better for her than the poison, a public humiliation for her rival, delivered by the Alpha himself. Alara lowered her head again, her mind racing. What could she do? A clumsy servant. That was all she could be. She slowly, deliberately, began to gather her spilled rags, her hands trembling. An accident. It had to look like an accident. "She is mute, my Lord Alpha," a voice interjected. It was Boren, the head steward, a man whose face was a permanent mask of sour disapproval. And clearly, as clumsy as she is silent, she has never caused such a disruption before. "Mute?" Kaelin's voice was laced with disbelief. He crouched down, forcing her to meet his gaze. His proximity was overwhelming. The scent of his fury was laced with something else now: confusion, curiosity. It swirled around her, a heady, terrifying mix. His amber eyes searched her face, and for a terrifying second, she thought he could see right through her, past the grime and the silence to the princess hiding beneath. "Look at me!" She forced herself to lift her chin. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. To be this close to him, the mate she could never claim, was a unique form of torture. She could see the flecks of gold in his eyes, the slight stubble along his jaw. The urge to reach out, to touch him, was a physical ache. "Is this true? You cannot speak?" he asked, his voice softer now, meant for her alone. She gave a single, jerky nod. He studied her for a long moment, his brow furrowed. She felt a flicker of the mate. Bond. A subtle pull in her chest, a silent question passing between their souls. Why? He didn't understand it, but he felt it. A connection to this lowly servant girl that made no sense. He looked from her wide, frightened eyes to the spilled wine, then to Lady Seraphina, who was now being fussed over by her ladies-in-waiting. A flicker of suspicion crossed his face, there and gone in an instant. "Clean this mess," he said, his voice once again hard and commanding, as he rose to his full height. "And then report to my chambers. The steward is right. You have never caused a disruption. I want to know why you chose tonight to start." He turned and walked back to the high table without another glance, leaving Alara in the center of the silent, staring hall. The command was a death sentence. To be summoned to the Alpha's private chambers was unheard of for a servant, unless it was for punishment. Whispers erupted around her like the hiss of snakes. Boren grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her skin like talons. "You have brought shame on this household, girl," he hissed, his breath sour with wine. "Get up. Do as the Alpha commands." Her legs felt like water as she stood. She cleaned the spill under the steward's hawkish gaze, her movements numb and mechanical. Every nerve in her body was screaming. He was suspicious. Her desperate act had not been seen merely as clumsiness, but as an act with intent. And now she would have to face him, alone, with no words to defend herself. When the mess was cleared, Boren marched her through the keep, his grip unforgiving. The stone corridors were cold and silent, a stark contrast to the noise of the feast. They stopped before a set of heavy oak doors guarded by two of the Alpha's personal guard. They looked at her with a mixture of pity and contempt. "The girl, as commanded by the Alpha," Boren announced, shoving her forward. One of the guards opened the door, and she was pushed inside. The door boomed shut behind her, the sound of the heavy bolt sliding into place echoing the frantic beat of her own heart. She was trapped. The Alpha's chambers were larger than the entire servants' dormitory. A fire crackled in a vast stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with books and maps. The air smelled intensely of him pine and frost and leather, and it made her feel both faint and strangely safe. Kalen stood by the fire, his back to her, one hand resting on the mantel. He had shed his formal jerkin and was now in a simple linen shirt that did little to hide the powerful muscles of his back and shoulders. The last time a servant was summoned here, it was because he was caught stealing silver, Kailan said, his voice a low, contemplative rumble. I had his hand removed. Alara's blood ran cold. She stood frozen just inside the door, her hands clenched at her sides. He turned slowly to face her. The firelight carved his face into harsh planes and soft shadows. The anger was gone from his eyes, replaced by an unnerving intensity. You, however, did not steal silver. You spilled water, and in doing so, you may have saved my life. Her breath hitched. He knew, or he suspected. That wine was a gift from Lady Seraphina, he continued, his eyes never leaving hers. From a family that seeks a marriage alliance, to accuse her of poisoning me is treason. To spill her offering is a grave insult. But you looked at that goblet like it was a coiled viper. He took a step closer. I want to know why, and I will not accept your silence as an answer. You will find a way to tell me. Now. Alara's mind was a whirlwind of panic. He was too perceptive, too intelligent. He had seen past the clumsy act to the desperate intention beneath. She was trapped in his chambers, under his intense scrutiny, and her only defense, her silence, was the very thing he refused to accept. She shook her head, a small, helpless gesture, and took an involuntary step back. Her gaze dropped to the floor, unable to bear the weight of his stare. How could she explain? Writing a note would be an admission of knowledge she shouldn't possess. It would invite questions she couldn't answer without revealing everything. "Do not look away from me," Kalen commanded, his voice soft but unyielding. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He stopped just before her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He gently placed a finger under her chin, forcing her to look up at him. His touch was like lightning, a searing jolt that shot through her entire body. The mate bond flared to life, a hungry, desperate thing that yearned for more. His scent was intoxicating, a wild, clean fragrance that filled her head and made her dizzy. "There is more to you than a mute servant girl," he murmured, his thumb stroking softly along her jawline. His eyes were dark, searching. "I have seen you in the halls. You move like a shadow, trying to be invisible. But I see you. I have always seen you. There is a strength in you, a fire in your eyes. It was there tonight, when you looked at me." Her heart ached. He saw her. In a world that had rendered her invisible, he saw something real. The tragedy of it was a bitter pill. The one person who could truly see her was the one she had to hide from the most. Tears pricked at the back of her eyes, hot and threatening. She would not cry. Crying was a weakness she could not afford. She pulled her chin from his grasp and turned away, walking towards the hearth. She needed space, needed to think. On a small writing desk near the fire, she saw a quill and a pot of ink. An idea, desperate and risky, began to form. She picked up the quill. Her hands were still shaking, but her resolve hardened. She could not tell him the truth, but she could give him a piece of it, wrapped in a lie. She dipped the quill in the ink and began to write on a press. Scrap of parchment. "My lord," she wrote, her script neat and elegant, a relic of a life she was forced to forget. "Forgive my actions. I am not accustomed to the crowds. The steward jostled me. It was an accident. I meant no disrespect." She pushed the parchment towards him on the desk. It was a weak explanation, a flimsy shield, but it was all she had. Kalen picked it up. He read the words, his expression unreadable. Then he let out a short, humorless laugh. "An accident," he repeated, his voice dripping with skepticism. He crumpled the parchment in his fist. "Your hands do not shake from fear of crowds. They shake because you are a terrible liar." He moved to stand behind her, his presence a heavy weight at her back. "Your handwriting is that of a high-born lady, not a scullery maid. You smell of lie and fear, but underneath it, there is something else. Something I can't quite place." He leaned closer, inhaling near her hair. Alara froze, every muscle in her body tensing. "The herbs," she prayed the herbs would hold. "Who are you?" he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. She squeezed her eyes shut. This was a nightmare. He was unraveling her, thread by thread. She had to get away, had to put distance between them before he discovered a truth that would get them both killed. She spun around, intending to flee, to beg the guards to let her out, to return to the safety of the servants' quarters. But she turned directly into him. Her hands came up against the hard wall of his chest. His arms came around her instantly, not to harm, but to steady her, to hold her. The contact was devastating. Skin to skin, even through the thin fabric of their clothes, the bond between them ignited like a forest fire. A gasp escaped her, the only sound she had made. His body was hard and warm, a perfect fit against hers. Her head swam with his scent, no longer just pine and frost, but something richer, muskier, possessive, mine. Her inner two-mate wolf howled. Mine. His wolf seemed to answer, a low growl rumbling in his chest that she felt more than heard. His amber eyes darkened to a molten gold, the sign of his wolf rising to the surface. He stared down at her, his gaze filled with a raw, predatory hunger that was mirrored by a shocking, fierce desire within her. He recognized her, not her name or her past, but her soul. He was recognizing his mate. Moon goddess, he breathed, his voice rough with disbelief. He lowered his head, his lips, just a breath from hers. What are you? The question was not one of identity, but of destiny. It was the question their souls had been asking since the moment they first saw each other. And as his mouth descended towards hers, Alara knew that the answer, and the kiss that would surely follow, would ruin everything. Panic, sharp and absolute, cut through the intoxicating haze of the mate bond. If he kissed her, he would know. A true mate's kiss was a revelation, a sharing of souls. He would feel her magic, taste her royal blood, see the secrets she guarded with her life. It would be a bond forged, and a death sentence signed in the very same moment. With a strength born of pure desperation, she shoved against his chest. The move was so unexpected that he stumbled back a step, his arms dropping from around her. The loss of his touch was like a physical blow, leaving her cold and aching, but it was necessary. She shook her head violently, her eyes wide with a silent, frantic plea. Don't. Kalen stared at her, his chest rising and falling heavily. The gold in his eyes slowly receded, leaving behind a deep, burning confusion and a flicker of hurt. He looked down at his own hands as if they had betrayed him. What is this? He demanded, his voice strained. What is this hold you have over me? One moment I want to punish you, the next I want to claim you. Alara backed away, her hands held up in a gesture of surrender. She had to de-escalate. This had to push him away before he broke through her defenses. She gestured wildly around the opulent room, then pointed to herself, to her drab, worn tunic. She tried to convey the impossible gulf between them. You are an alpha. I am nothing. You think I care about that? He scoffed, though a flicker of doubt crossed his face. The rigid hierarchy of their world was ingrained in him. Alphas did not mate with nameless servants. It was not done. It makes no sense. My wolf, it recognizes you. It calls for you. He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of profound frustration. He began to pace before the fire like a caged wolf, the powerful muscles in his back flexing under his shirt. Alara watched him, her heart a painful knot in her chest. She was the cause of his turmoil. Her very existence was a threat to his peace, to his rule. Seraphina, he said suddenly, stopping his pacing. He looked at Alara, his eyes narrowed in thought. You did this because of her. You were not protecting me from the wine. You were protecting me from her. It was a leap of logic, but it was dangerously close to the truth. Alara's expression must have betrayed her, because a look of grim understanding dawned on his face. She has been persistent, he admitted, his voice low. Her family is powerful. An alliance would secure my northern border. Everyone expects me to accept her as my Luna. He looked at Alara, and the raw emotion in his eyes stole her breath. But I cannot. Not when my soul feels tethered to a silent servant girl who looks at me with the eyes of a fallen queen. A shiver went down her spine. A fallen queen. Did he know? No. It was just a turn of phrase, a poetic observation. It had to be. He walked to the door and slid the heavy bolt back with a resounding thud. The sound made her jump. "I cannot keep you here," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the earlier emotion. It was the voice of an alpha making a decision. "It is not safe for you, or for me." He was letting her go. A wave of relief so intense, it made her knees weak washed over her. But it was followed swiftly by a pang of loss so sharp it felt like a blade twisting in her gut. He was sending her away. "Boren has quarters for the senior household staff near the kitchens," he said, not looking at her. "You will no longer work in the scullery. You will be assigned as my personal attendant. You will bring my meals. You will attend to my chambers. You will be at my side from dawn until dusk." Alara stared at him, her relief evaporating into stunned horror. That wasn't sending her away. That was pulling her closer, into the very heart of the danger. "I will not have you out of my sight," he continued, his voice hardening. "I do not trust Serafina, and until I understand what this connection between us is, I will not have you scrubbing floors where any stray boot could harm you. You are under my protection, now, whether you want it or not." It was a cage, a gilded velvet-lined cage, but a cage nonetheless. He was doing it to protect her, but in doing so, he was placing her directly in Serafina's path. He was also ensuring they would be in constant proximity, a daily torture for them both, a constant strain on the bond that screamed for completion. "Go," he commanded, his voice rough. "Your new duties begin at sunrise." She didn't need to be told twice. She fled from the room, not daring to look back, the scent of him clinging to her like a second skin. As she hurried down the cold stone corridors, she knew her life had just changed irrevocably. She had escaped the Alpha's immediate wrath, but she had been thrust into a far more dangerous game. She was no longer an invisible ghost. She was now the Alpha's personal shadow, a position that came with a target painted squarely on her back. The next morning, Ilara woke before the first hint of dawn, the straw mattress, in her new small private room feeling both like a luxury and a prison cell. The room was adjacent to the main kitchens, a significant step up from the communal dormitory, but its very existence was a brand, marking her as the Alpha's special interest. The other senior staff, the cook, the steward, the head groom, already looked at her with a mixture of suspicion and resentment. She dressed in the new, finer spun tunic left for her, the gray fabric soft against her skin. It felt wrong, like wearing a costume. She performed her morning ritual with more urgency than usual, crushing the bitter hawkweed leaves and mixing the paste with water, rubbing it into her skin to mask her true scent. It was a flimsy shield against an Alpha's senses, especially a mate's, but it was all she had. Her first duty was to bring the Alpha his morning meal. She entered the kitchens to collect the tray, and the head cook, a stout woman named Helga, slammed it onto the counter with a pointed glare. "Be sure not to spill this one, girl," Helga sniffed, her disdain palpable. Alara ignored the jibe, her focus entirely on the food. She subtly leaned over the tray, inhaling deeply. Porridge, honey, fresh bread, sliced ham. The scents were clean, wholesome, no hint of nightshade, no cloying sweetness of a love potion. For now, it was safe. She gave Helga a small nod of thanks and carried the heavy tray towards the Alpha's chambers. The two guards outside his door watched her approach with unreadable expressions. They opened the doors for her without a word. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she stepped inside. Kalen was already awake, standing before a large map of the territories that covered one wall. He was dressed for training, in simple black trousers and a loose-fitting tunic that accentuated the breadth of his shoulders. He turned as she entered, and his amber eyes immediately found hers. The air in the room thickened, charged with the same intensity as the night before. "Good morning," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was absurdly domestic, a simple greeting that felt laden with 1,000 unspoken words. Alara inclined her head and set the tray down on a small table near the fire. She moved with quiet efficiency, pouring him a cup of water, arranging the plate. She was hyper-aware of his gaze on her, tracking her every movement. It made her skin feel tight, her nerves stretched thin. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, walking over to the table. She froze for a second before giving a slight nod. It was a lie. She had barely slept, her mind replaying their encounter over and over, his scent haunting her dreams. He sat down and looked at the food, then back at her. "Will you join me?" The offer was shocking. A servant did not eat with their alpha. It was a breach of every protocol. She shook her head quickly, her eyes wide with alarm, and took a step back towards the door. "Stay," he commanded, his voice gentle but firm. "I do not wish to eat alone." He gestured to the other chair at the table. "Please." The please was her undoing. It was a request, not an order, a sign of respect she had not been shown in years. Hesitantly, she sat on the very edge of the chair, her back ramrod straight, feeling utterly out of place. He pushed the plate of bread towards her. She shook her head. Her stomach was a tight knot of anxiety. She couldn't have eaten a single bite. They sat in a strange, charged silence as he ate. He seemed to be studying her, trying to piece together a puzzle. "I have been thinking," he said finally, pushing his plate away, "about what you did. It was a risk, a great one. You invited my wrath to—" "What? Avert an insult to Lady Seraphina?" His tone was skeptical. "No, that's not it. You were not protecting her honor. You were protecting me." Alara held her breath. "Which means you believe she means me harm," he continued, his eyes boring into hers. "Why? What do you know about her?" She stared at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. The silence stretched between them, thick with his unanswered questions. She had no answers she could give. A sharp knock on the door broke the tension. A guard entered. "My Lord Alpha, Lady Seraphina is here. She insists on seeing you." Kalen's jaw tightened. A muscle flexed in his cheek. "Let her in," he said, his eyes never leaving Alara's. It was a test. Seraphina swept into the room, a vision in emerald green. Her scent of jasmine filled the space instantly, a sweet invasive fog. She stopped short when she saw Alara sitting at the table with the alpha. Her beautiful face, arranged in a look of sweet concern, twisted into a mask of pure fury for a split second before she smoothed it over. "Kalen, darling," she purred, gliding towards him. "I was so worried after that dreadful incident last night. I could not rest. And then to hear you had taken that clumsy wretch into your personal service." Her eyes, the color of dark jade, raked over Alara with contempt. "Is that wise? To reward such incompetence?" "I reward what I see fit, Seraphina," Kalen said, his voice cool. "Alara will be serving me from now on." "Alara," Seraphina repeated, tasting the name with disdain. She turned her full attention on the silent girl. "I suppose I should thank you. If you had not spilled that water, the alpha would have drunk the wine I so lovingly prepared for him. A special vintage, from my family's own vineyards. It would be a shame for it to have been wasted." Her smile was razor sharp. It was a threat, veiled in courtesy. "I know what you did, and you will pay for it." Alara felt a chill crawl up her spine. This woman was more dangerous than she had even imagined. Her hatred was a palpable thing, a cold aura that emanated from her. "That is enough," Kalen said, rising to his feet. He moved to stand subtly between Serafina and Alara, a protective stance that was not lost on either woman. "Alara has her duties, and I have mine. I am due at the training grounds." "Of course, my love," Serafina said, placing a possessive hand on his arm. "I will walk with you." She shot a final, triumphant smirk at Alara over her shoulder as she led Kalen from the room. The message was clear. He is mine. You are nothing. Alara sat alone in the silent chamber, the lingering scent of jasmine making her stomach churn. The battle lines had been drawn, and she was standing on them, alone and unarmed. The days that followed settled into a pattern of excruciating tension. Alara was Kalen's constant shadow, a silent presence in his powerful orbit. She brought his meals, organized his papers, stood sentinel in the corner of the council room while he debated pack business, and waited outside the training grounds while he sparred with his warriors. Every moment was a trial. Being so close to him, breathing in his scent, feeling the constant, thrumming pull of the mate bond was a sweet agony. He, in turn, watched her with a hawk's intensity. He seemed to have accepted her silence, for now, but he tested her in other ways. He would ask her opinion on a treaty with a simple gesture, a raised eyebrow. He would watch her reactions to his council members, seeming to value her silent assessment. He was learning to read her, to understand the language of her eyes, the subtle shifts in her posture. It was terrifyingly intimate, and through it all, there was Serafina. She was a constant, venomous presence. She found endless reasons to be at Kalen's side, touching his arm, laughing at his jests, inserting herself between them at every opportunity. Her attacks on Alara were subtle but relentless. A misplaced stack of important documents that Alara would be blamed for. A forgotten muddy cloak left for Alara to clean just before she was to serve dinner. Small, cruel barbs designed to undermine her and remind her of her place. Alara bore it all with a quiet stoicism that seemed to infuriate Serafina and intrigue Kalen in equal measure. Her focus remained singular, keeping Kalen safe. Before every meal, she would check the food, not just for the scent of poison, but for the shimmering, corrupt tang of magic. Twice more she found it. Once, a sleeping draught in his evening wine, which she disposed of by, accidentally, knocking the pitcher off a high shelf. The second time, a more insidious charm woven into the thread of a new tunic, meant to cause agitation and paranoia. She'd managed to damage the shirt while mending it, forcing it to be discarded. Each time, Kalen would look at her with an expression of knowing suspicion, but he never called her out on it. A silent understanding was growing between them. He was beginning to trust her instincts, even if he didn't understand them. The tension reached a breaking point during the week of the new moon. A delegation from the neighboring Stonecrest pack was visiting to negotiate territory rights. The negotiations were fraught, the air in the council room thick with barely veiled hostility. The Stonecrest Alpha, a brutish man named Fendrel, was known for his aggressive tactics. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of talks, Kalen dismissed his council, looking weary and frustrated. He remained in the council room, staring at the maps, with only Alara for company. "He's a stubborn fool," Kalen muttered, more to himself than to her. Fendrel would risk a war over 100 acres of useless swamp, because his pride is at stake. He finally turned to look at her, his shoulders slumped. The burdens of being an alpha were etched on his face. "What would you do?" The question startled her. He was genuinely asking for her counsel. She walked over to the map. Her father had been a king and a brilliant strategist. She had spent countless hours in his war room, absorbing his lessons. She looked at the disputed territory, then at the lands surrounding it. She picked up a charcoal pencil from the table. She circled not the swamp, but a stretch of barren hills deep within Kaelin's own territory. Then she drew a line from the hills to the Stonecrest border. Kaelin watched her, his brow furrowed. The granite hills? They're worthless. Barely support a few goats. Alara shook her head. She tapped the charcoal pencil on the hills, then made a gesture of digging. She then pointed to her own ear, and then gestured towards the Stonecrest lands. His eyes widened in comprehension. Echoes, he breathed. The sound it would carry from those hills. We could establish a listening post. We could hear their patrols, their movements, long before they reached our borders. He looked at the map, then back at her, his face alight with a new, startling respect. To give him the swamp he wants in exchange for the hills he thinks are worthless, it's brilliant. It gives him a public victory while giving us a massive strategic advantage. He stared at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. It was the first genuine, unguarded smile he had ever given her, and it hit her with the force of a physical blow. It transformed his harsh, handsome features into something breathtaking. You are wasted as a servant, he said softly. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line she had drawn on the map, his hand covering hers. The warmth of his skin against hers was electric. The bond between them surged, a current of warmth and rightness that flowed through her veins. The moment was shattered by the clearing of a throat. They both jumped, snatching their hands back as if burned. Serafina stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her face a thunderous mask. Am I interrupting something? She asked, her voice dangerously sweet. Serafina, Kaelin said, his voice tight with annoyance. This is a closed meeting. It looked more like a strategy session, she said, her eyes flicking from the map to Alara's face, which was surely flushed. With your serving girl. How very progressive of you, my Lord Alpha. The sarcasm was thick enough to cut with a knife. She walked into the room, deliberately placing herself between them. She ran a hand over the map, smudging the charcoal line Alara had drawn. Do not let this little mute fill your head with foolish ideas, Kaelin. She knows about scrubbing floors, not winning wars. She knows more than you think, Kaelin said, his voice dangerously low. His protectiveness was a warm shield around Alara. Does she? Serafina's eyes narrowed into slits. Then perhaps she knows to stay away from that which is not hers. She turned and gave Alara a look of pure, undiluted malice. And in that moment, Alara felt it. A cold, slithering tendril of magic, thin as a needle, probing at her mind, at her defenses. It smelled of rot and decay. Serafina was a witch, a powerful one. Alara instinctively threw up a mental shield, a trick of her own suppressed magic she hadn't used in years. It was like slamming a door in the face of an intruder. Serafina gasped, her eyes widening in shock and fury. She had felt the resistance. She now knew Alara was not just some ordinary girl. The game had just changed. Serafina no longer saw her as a simple rival for Kaelin's affection. She saw her as a threat to her power. And Alara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that Serafina would stop at nothing to eliminate her. The aftermath of Serafina's magical probe was a silent declaration of war. The air in the keep grew thick with an unspoken menace. Serafina no longer bothered with petty torments. Her animosity was now a cold, watchful waiting. She knew Alara had power, and Alara knew that she knew. It was a terrifying stalemate, each waiting for the other to make a move. Kaelin, though unaware of the magical nature of the confrontation, had felt the shift. He became even more protective of Alara, rarely letting her out of his sight. This forced proximity was both a comfort and a torment. The bond between them deepened with every shared glance, every accidental touch, every moment of silent understanding. It was a beautiful, blooming thing in the heart of a gathering storm. His scent was a constant comfort, a promise of safety that his presence provided, but it also frayed her nerves, a constant reminder of what she could never have. The turning point came on the night of a violent thunderstorm. Rain lashed against the stone walls of the keep, and wind howled through the corridors like a grieving spirit. The Stonecrest delegation had departed that morning. The treaty-signed Kaelin had used her strategy, and it had worked flawlessly. He had been in a triumphant mood all day, but as night fell, a strange restlessness seemed to settle over him. He had dismissed her for the night, but Alara couldn't sleep. A sense of deep unease coiled in her gut. Seraphina had been conspicuously absent all day, and that, more than anything, set Alara on edge. Something was wrong. She crept from her small room and made her way through the darkened, silent keep towards the Alpha's chambers. The guards were at their posts, but they were drowsy, lulled by the late hour and the storm's fury. She slipped past them, a shadow in the flickering torchlight, and pressed her ear to the heavy oak door. She heard a thud, then a groan. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. She didn't hesitate. She pushed the door open. It was unbolted and slipped inside. The room was lit only by the dying embers in the hearth. Kaelin was on the floor near his bed, on his hands and knees, his body racked with tremors. His breath came in ragged, painful gasps. A silver goblet lay on its side nearby, a few drops of a dark liquid staining the rug. Alara rushed to his side, her heart pounding with terror. She knelt beside him, her hands hovering over his back, afraid to touch him. "Alara," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. He managed to look up at her, and what she saw in his eyes made her blood run cold. His pupils were dilated. His face was pale and slick with a feverish sweat. "Poison! Seraphina! She brought me wine." He had finally seen the truth, but it was too late. This was no simple sleeping draught or compulsion charm. The scent in the room was acrid and metallic, with the dark, cloying undertone of black lotus, a rare, magically potent poison that attacked a shifter's healing abilities. It was lethal, and it was working fast. "The healers," he gasped, then cried out as a violent spasm seized him. She knew the pack healers couldn't help. This was a magical poison. It required a magical cure. A cure only she possessed. But to use her magic, her true Silverwood magic, would be a full revelation. It would drain her, leave her exposed. It would unmask her true scent for all to smell. But the alternative was watching him die. There was no choice. She gently helped him lie down, his head resting in her lap. He was burning with fever, his powerful body frighteningly weak. "Stay with me," she pleaded in her mind, her hands stroking his sweat-dampened hair. She closed her eyes and reached deep inside herself, to the place where her magic lay dormant, chained by her vow of silence. She pulled at it, not with force, but with love. With the desperate, all-consuming power of the mate bond, she thought of him, of his strength, his unexpected kindness, his soul that called to hers. She poured all of her yearning, all of her fierce, protective love into that single point of focus. A soft, silver light began to glow around her hands. It smelled of rain-washed petals and clean starlight, her true scent finally unbound. The bitter hawkweed on her skin was burned away by the pure magic. She placed one hand on his band, forehead and the other over his heart. She began to hum. It wasn't a song with words, but a melody of pure power, an ancient lullaby of healing that was her birthright. The silver light flowed from her hands into his body, a gentle, cleansing tide. It sought out the dark, twisted magic of the poison, surrounding it, smothering it, dissolving it. The process was agonizing. It felt like she was pouring her own life force into him. The room grew cold as her own body temperature dropped. Black spots danced in her vision. Kalen's shudders slowly subsided, his breathing evening out. The feverish heat under her palm began to cool. The color was returning to his face. He was going to live. Exhausted, on the verge of collapse, she let the light fade. The last of her strength gave out, and she slumped forward, her head resting on his chest, her world going dark. Her last conscious thought was of his scent, no longer tainted by poison, but clean and pure, pine and frost and winter air. And mingled with it now, for the first time, was her own. Wildflowers and starlight, unmistakable, unmasked. Alara awoke to the feeling of being held. She was in Kalen's bed, cocooned in furs that smelled deeply of him. A soft morning light filtered through the high windows. For a moment, she was disoriented, the events of the previous night feeling like a fever dream. Then it all came rushing back. The poison, the magic. She sat up with a gasp. Kalen was sitting in the chair by the bed, watching her. He was no longer pale and feverish, but strong and vital, though his face was grim and his eyes held a storm of emotions. He was alive. The relief was so profound, it almost brought her to her knees. "You saved me," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was rough, thick with an emotion she couldn't name. She could only nod, her throat tight. "Your scent," he continued, his gaze intense. "It's different. The herbs are gone. This is the real you." He inhaled deeply, his eyes closing for a moment as if savoring it. Wildflowers, like the meadows in the high mountains. His eyes opened again, and they were shining with a fierce, possessive light. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever smelled. It's the scent of my mate." The words hung in the air between them, a truth finally spoken aloud. He knew. He had felt it before, but now, with her scent unmasked, and the memory of her life-saving magic, he knew it with an unshakable certainty. Before she could react, he was on his feet and crossing to the bed. He sat on the edge, taking her small, cold hands in his large, warm ones. "All this time," he whispered, his voice full of wonder and regret, "you have been right here, and I was a blind fool." He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. The touch was reverent, adoring. It sent a shiver of pure bliss through her. This was everything she had ever dreamed of, a fantasy she had never allowed herself to entertain. "But you are so much more than just my mate," he said, his expression turning serious again. "You have magic, Alara, a powerful healing magic, the kind I have only read about in old legends, the magic of the Silverwood line." Her blood turned to ice. She tried to pull her hands away, but he held them fast. "Don't," he said gently. "Don't hide from me anymore. I see it now. The way you carry yourself, your knowledge of strategy, your royal grace, even in a servant's tunic. You are Princess Alara, aren't you? The one they said perished in the fire with the rest of your family." Tears she had held back for 5 long years finally fell. They streamed down her cheeks, hot and silent. There was no point in denying it any longer. She gave a single, slow nod. A look of profound pain crossed his face. All this time, you have been living in my kitchens, scrubbing my floors. A princess, my mate. His voice broke. What they did to your family was an atrocity. I should have known. I should have seen it. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. She buried her face in his shoulder, her silent sobs shaking her entire body. He just held her, stroking her hair, murmuring words of comfort, his scent surrounding her, a haven of safety in a world that had been anything but. Why the silence? He asked after a long time, his voice a soft rumble against her ear. Was it part of your hiding? She pulled back, her face tear-streaked. This was the hardest part. The secret she had guarded even more closely than her own identity. She looked into his concerned, loving eyes and knew she had to trust him. She had to tell him everything. She got out of the bed and went to the writing desk. Her hands were steady now. She wrote quickly, pouring out the story she had carried alone for so long. My brother Liren is alive, she wrote. He was just a boy. When our keep fell, our mother, a powerful seer, used the last of her strength to place a magical vow on me. I am to remain silent and hide my identity until his 18th birthday, when he comes of age and can safely claim his throne. If I speak a single word before then, the magic will consume me, and the protective ward she placed around him will shatter, revealing his location to our enemies, the same ones who hired Seraphina's family to destroy us. She pushed the parchment to him. As he read it, his face hardened into a mask of cold fury. He looked up from the page, his eyes blazing with a righteous anger. So Seraphina is not just a jealous rival, he snarled. She is an agent of your enemies. Her attempt on my life was not to win my hand, but to destabilize my pack, to take control of this territory for them. He stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. She will pay for this, for what she did to you, to your family, and for her treason against this pack. She will pay for everything. Kaelin, a voice called from the doorway. It was Steward Boren, his face pale with alarm. My Lord Alpha, Lady Seraphina has invoked the old laws. She accuses the mute servant of witchcraft and the attempted murder of your person. She claims the girl enthralled you with dark magic. She has the council, and she demands a trial and execution by sundown. Kaelin and Alara stared at each other in horror. Seraphina had made her move. She was twisting the truth, using Alara's own magic against her. She was going to execute the princess she had been sent to find, and she was going to use Kaelin's own pack to do it. The world tilted on its axis. Seraphina's move was audacious, brilliant in its cruelty. She had taken Alara's act of salvation and painted it as an act of damnation. In a world where magic was feared and misunderstood, a mute servant girl suddenly manifesting healing powers was easier to believe as witchcraft than a miracle. Seraphina was using the pack's fear and ignorance as her weapon. She cannot do this, Kaelin growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that promised violence. The alpha wolf was at the surface, his eyes flashing gold, his protective instincts raging. She can, my lord, Boren said, his voice trembling slightly. The old laws are clear. An accusation of dark magic against the alpha, brought by a highborn, must be met with a swift trial. The council is already gathering. They are afraid. She has told them the girl's magic is what made you ill, and that she, Seraphina, was the one to brew the antidote. It was a perfect, venomous lie. She was claiming Alara's heroism as her own. I will not allow it, Kaelin declared. I am the Alpha. My word is law. But your word will be seen as compromised, Boren argued, his face etched with worry. She has already planted the seed that you are enthralled. If you defend the girl without proof, it will only confirm her claims. It could split the pack, my lord. Some will stand with you, but many will follow the old laws and the council. Kalen slammed his fist onto the table, making the inkpot jump. He was trapped. To defend Alara was to prove Seraphina's point. To allow the trial was to condemn his mate to death. He looked at Alara, his face a mask of torment and fury. He was the most powerful man in the territories, yet he was helpless. Alara's mind raced, cold and clear through the fog of fear. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Seraphina wanted a public trial, a spectacle, and that was the opening Alara needed. It was her only chance. She walked to Kalen, placing a calming hand on his clenched fist. He immediately covered her hand with his own, his touch desperate. She looked him in the eye, her gaze steady and resolute. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. Let it happen. What? He breathed, his eyes wide with disbelief. Alara, no, they will condemn you. She shook her head. She turned to the writing desk and scribbled a quick note. Trust me. He stared at the words, then back at her face. He saw the fire in her eyes, the steel in her spine. This was not the frightened servant girl from the great hall. This was a princess, a queen in waiting, and she had a plan. The trust between them, forged in secrets and silent conversations, held firm. All right, he said, his voice strained but firm. He turned to Boren. Tell the council I will attend the trial. It will be held in the main square, before the entire pack, at sundown. Let Seraphina have her stage. Boren bowed, a look of profound confusion on his face, and hurried out to do the Alpha's bidding. Once they were alone, Kalen turned to Alara, his hands gripping her shoulders. What are you going to do? He asked, his voice raw with fear for her. You cannot speak to defend yourself. Your magic is the very thing she is using against you. She gave him a sad, small smile. She reached up and touched her own throat. Then she pointed to her heart. The vow. It was tied to her life force. She had saved him by pouring her magic, her love, into him. But the vow itself remained. There was only one way to break it. Not by gentle persuasion, but by force. An act of will so powerful it would shatter the ancient magic. But the cost was immense. Her mother's spell was designed to protect her son by sacrificing her daughter if needed. Breaking the vow before its time would unleash a backlash of volatile, uncontrolled magic. It could consume her, burn her out from the inside. It was a desperate, final gamble. A choice to die on her own terms, speaking the truth, rather than be executed on the back of a lie. Kalen seemed to understand her intention. The color drained from his face. No, he whispered. Alara, you can't. It will kill you. She shook her head, her eyes fierce. It is the only way to save him, to save her brother, to save both their people. From the clutches of their enemies, she had to speak. She had to reclaim her voice, even if it was the last act of her life. He pulled her into a desperate, crushing hug. I will not lose you, he vowed, his voice thick with unshed tears. I just found you. She held him tightly, memorizing the feel of his arms around her, the solid beat of his heart against her ear, the comforting scent of pine and frost. For 5 years, she had been a ghost, but in his arms, she felt real, and she would not let Seraphina take that from them. As the guards came to take her to the dungeons to await her trial, she gave Kalen one last, long look. It was a promise, a vow far stronger than the one that kept her silent. I will fight. In the cold, damp darkness of her cell, Alara did not weep. She sat on the hard stone floor and gathered her strength. She reached inside herself, not to the gentle, healing light she had used for Kaelin, but deeper, to the core of her being, where the raw, untamed power of her bloodline resided. For years, she had suppressed it, hidden it, feared it. Now, she embraced it. As the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the land, she felt the magic begin to stir. It was a silver fire, building within her, waiting for the moment of its release. She was no longer Ilara the servant. She was Ilara of the Silverwood line, and she was ready to burn the world down to protect what was hers. The execution square was packed. The entire pack had been assembled, their faces a sea of confusion, fear, and morbid curiosity in the dying light of the Sunday. Torches had been lit, casting flickering, monstrous shadows against the keep's stone walls. A wooden platform had been erected in the center, and on it stood a grim-faced executioner, his axe resting against a chopping block. Alara was marched from the dungeons, her hands bound before her. She kept her head held high, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. She saw fear, yes, but she also saw doubt in some faces, especially among the senior warriors who respected their alpha above all else. That was something she could use. On a raised dais to the side of the platform sat the council members, with Lady Seraphina in a place of honor. She was dressed in black, a mockery of mourning, a picture of false piety. Her eyes glittered with triumph as she watched Alara being led to the block. Kaelin stood on the dais as well, his face carved from stone, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides. He was a statue of contained rage. His eyes met Alara's across the square, and in their amber depths, she saw his unwavering trust and his heart-wrenching fear for her. It gave her strength. Steward Boren stepped forward and unrolled a scroll. His voice, usually so steady, trembled as he read the charges. The accused, a servant known as Alara, is charged with the crime of forbidden witchcraft, of casting a dark enchantment upon our Lord Alpha, Kaelin, and of the attempted murder of his person by magical means. The accuser is the highborn Lady Seraphina of the Blackwood line. Seraphina rose, the picture of sorrowful duty. "I do this with a heavy heart," she said, her voice ringing with false sincerity. "I saw with my own eyes as this creature used her dark arts on our beloved Alpha. She weakened him, enthralled him. It was my own knowledge of healing potions that saved him from her clutches. For the safety of the pack, for the purity of our bloodlines, this evil must be purged." A murmur went through the crowd. Her words were poison, expertly delivered. Boren cleared his throat. "The council has found the accused guilty. The sentence is death." He looked at Alara with a flicker of pity. "Does the condemned have any last words?" The question was a formality, a cruel joke at the expense of a mute. Seraphina smirked. This was her final triumph. Alara took a deep breath. She closed her eyes and focused inward, gathering the silver fire that she had been stoking for hours. She thought of her parents, of her lost kingdom. She thought of her brother, Liren, living in hiding. She thought of Kaelin, her mate, her love, the man she was willing to die for. She wrapped the magic in her love for him, giving it purpose, giving it a target. She opened her eyes and looked directly at Seraphina. Then she broke her vow. She did not whisper. She did not scream. She spoke. "Stop." The word was not loud, but it resonated through the square as if a great bell had been struck. It was a voice of pure authority, a voice that had not been used in 5 years, clear and strong and ringing with power. A visible shock wave of silver light erupted from her, blasting outwards. It was not destructive, but it was powerful, staggering those closest to her and causing the torches to flare wildly. The magical chains of her mother's vow shattered into a million pieces of light. A wave of agony washed over her as the backlash hit. It felt like being torn apart from the inside, a searing white-hot pain. But she stood firm, gritting her teeth against it, refusing to fall. The entire square was in stunned silence. Jaws had dropped. Kaylin's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated shock and dawning hope. Seraphina's triumphant smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of utter disbelief and horror. "I am no witch," Alara said, her voice growing stronger with every word, fueled by the very magic that threatened to consume her. She held up her bound hands. "I am Alara of the House of Silverwood, rightful heir to the Western throne." Gasps of shock rippled through the crowd. The legend of the lost princess was known to all. "And you," she said, her voice dropping to a deadly tone as she pinned Seraphina with her gaze, "are a traitor and an assassin. Your family helped murder mine, and you came here to finish the job. You poisoned my mate, the alpha of this pack, not once, but multiple times." "Lies!" Seraphina shrieked, her composure finally cracking. "She is a witch! Look at her! The magic is pouring off her! Seize her!" But no one moved. They were mesmerized by the impossible sight of the mute girl speaking with the voice of a queen. Desperate, Seraphina gathered her own dark power. A sickly green energy coiled around her hands. "I will silence you myself," she screamed, and hurled a bolt of corrosive magic directly at Alara. "No!" Kaylin roared. He leaped from the dais, moving faster than anyone had ever seen him move. He threw himself in front of Alara, shielding her with his own body. The dark magic slammed into his back with a sickening crackle. He grunted in pain, but did not fall. Seeing him hurt on her behalf unleashed the last of Alara's control. The silver fire within her erupted, but it was not a weapon of attack. It was a beacon of truth and purification. She reached out, her hands still bound, and placed her fingertips on Kaylin's back, where the spell had struck. "Be healed," she commanded, and the silver light poured from her into him. It neutralized Seraphina's curse, purged the last vestiges of any poison from his system, and flared outwards, solidifying their mate bond in a blaze of golden-silver light that was visible to every person in the square. It was an undeniable sacred act, the truth made manifest. Seraphina screamed in fury as her magic, exposed as corrupt and evil by the pure light of the mate bond, backfired on her. The green energy recoiled, wrapping around her, and with a final desperate cry, she collapsed, her power stripped from her, leaving her nothing more than a trembling, defeated woman. In the stunned, absolute silence that followed, Kaylin turned and broke the ropes binding Alara's hands with a single, savage pull. He framed her face with his hands, his eyes shining with tears of relief and overwhelming love. "You spoke," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I did," she whispered back, a radiant smile breaking through her pain and exhaustion. He looked out at his pack, his voice booming with the full power of an alpha. "You have your proof. This is no witch. This is Princess Alara. This is my mate. This is your Luna." He lowered his head and kissed her. In front of the council, the executioner, and the entire pack, he claimed her. The kiss was not desperate or hungry, but full of reverence, love, and a promise of forever. A roar of approval went up from the crowd. a wave of sound that washed away all the fear and doubt, replaced by loyalty and awe. As Kalen finally broke the kiss, he rested his forehead against hers. "The pain," he murmured, his eyes searching hers with concern. "The backlash from the vow?" She smiled, feeling the last of the magical agony receding, soothed by the strength of their solidified bond. "Some things are worth the price," she said, her voice, her beautiful reclaimed voice, full of love. 1 month later, Alara stood on the balcony of the Alphas' their chambers, the rising sun casting a golden glow over the lands of the pack. She leaned back against Kalen's chest, his arms wrapped securely around her waist. She wore a simple gown of silver silk, the color of her house, and the weight of his mating mark on her neck was a comforting, permanent anchor. "It's quiet this morning," she murmured, breathing in the clean morning air. It was a simple observation, but the sheer joy of being able to speak it, to give voice to her thoughts, still felt like a miracle. "It is?" Kalen rumbled, his lips brushing against her temple. "It's because our most troublesome council members are currently mucking out the stables, as is the former Lady Seraphina." Alara smiled. After her defeat, Seraphina had confessed everything, implicating the enemies who had hired her family and revealing the location of their stronghold. Stripped of her magic and her title, she had been sentenced to a lifetime of hard labor. It was a fitting punishment. Kalen's council had been purged of her sympathizers, and Steward Boren, now fiercely loyal to his Luna, had been promoted. "And Lirin?" she asked softly. "A royal escort of my best warriors reached him 2 days ago," Kalen confirmed. "He is safe, and he is on his way here. The news says he is a fine young man, Alara. He will be ready to take back his throne, with the full backing of my pack." Tears of gratitude welled in her eyes. Everything she had sacrificed for, everything she had fought for, was coming to pass. Her brother was safe, her people would have their king, and she had found a home she never expected. "You know," Kalen said, his voice turning playful as he nuzzled her neck, inhaling her scent. "Life was much more peaceful when you were a mute servant." She laughed, turning in his arms to face him. "Is that a complaint, my Lord Alpha?" she teased, arching an eyebrow. "Never," he said, his expression turning serious, his amber eyes soft with love. "It's an observation. You were magnificent then, a silent storm, but now," he brushed a stray strand of hair from her face, "now that you can talk back, you are somehow even more magnificent, and so much more trouble." "You have no idea," she agreed, her voice full of laughter. He smiled, a slow, breathtaking smile that still made her heart skip a beat. "Some things change for the better," he whispered, and then he kissed her. The kiss was gentle and deep, a promise of sunrises to come, of a shared future built on a foundation of truth and sacrifice. She was no longer a hidden princess or a silent servant. She was a Luna, a mate, a queen in her own right. She was home.